The goal of the empirical review section is to criticize or to critique the methodology used in all the studies that you are assessing or reviewing to fine tune your one research method, or if it's a multi method or a mixed method. Now, the idea of empirical review of studies, many people just think that it is just to gather studies and paste. That is why the PG school will always ask, especially yes, postgraduate school will always ask for, I think, 15 studies for undergrad, for masters, then I think 30 for PhD, depending on the school. They want to see the gaps. In fact, research is all about methodology. So this section is very, very critical. All sections are important. Conceptual review, literature review, but this empirical review, what are you building on? What are you avoiding in the flaws of other people? So now people just dump different reviews, different methodologies in their empirical review. No, once your topic and the theory also somehow determines the best methodology that you can use. So it is very, very important once you have decided on a methodology, a research method, or if it's a mixed method, then you stick to that. The general misconception is that let me present surveys because I will use interview, or let me present interviews because I want to use surveys. No, if you're using surveys, present surveys in your empirical review. If you're using interviews, present interviews in your empirical review. If you're using focus group, if you're using photo voice, if you're using any type of research method, your idea is to critique what are the flaws and limitations of the previous studies. That is what you're supposed to do. The idea is that so that you avoid these limitations and improve the strengths in your own work. So that's the goal of empirical review of studies. Now, every study is contextual, whether quantitative and qualitative. The idea is not to scatter, downgrade, or demean another person's research. Every study is contextual, but every researcher will always notice limitations. That's why at the end of the study conclusion, that's if it's a thesis or dissertation or a journal, you will see the limitations. That is what you're supposed to pick. Your idea is if the person doesn't write limitations, when you read the work, you might come out with some certain limitations. So that is what you're supposed to pick so that when you gather all these limitations, you will ensure that you avoid it in your own work. Now, the popular one is survey. So let's use a survey. Let me say Ojo 2021, he did a survey on Facebook and academic performance. Then over dependence of self-reported data, maybe that was the limitation. You note it in your work, and maybe since there's over dependence on self-reported data, you might now want to recommend in your own work, maybe you want to do a mixed method or multi-method, depending, just to make sure that this over dependence is cleared. Then response bias, maybe the second study by Ade showed that response there's a response bias. Maybe Uche's study, after doing a survey of Facebook and educational academic development or performance, there was a low response rate. So how can your own study avoid low response rate? Then convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is mostly for um, qualitative studies. So how do you do a survey that there's a convenience sampling? How is it that it can be generalized? So when a study like Coyote uses convenience sampling, you know that generalization is not is going to be limited. A study can have a small sample size. When you have a small sample size, it limits the generalization, the reliability, and the validity. So you should avoid a small sample size. Non-representative sampling. You're sampling a large area like Jos North or Kano or Nigeria, and You didn't do multi-stage sampling, you didn't do quota sampling, you didn't do cluster sampling, stratified sampling. You're talking of Nigeria, but you just picked one local government. So maybe that is the challenge in Kayode's study that you want to avoid. Recall bias. You're doing a study on Facebook and academic learning, and your sample size or your population are people who have graduated 5 years ago. They will not remember. So maybe this is the challenge by Ojo 2021. Cross sectional limitation. We are used to cross sectional studies. Nobody is doing longitudinal studies. So maybe if you see that most of the studies are usually cross sectional, then maybe your own work could be longitudinal, or maybe a panel study. You give the survey January, you give the survey February, March, April, May, June, so that within 6 months, is there any difference? So instead of repeating the cross sectional that will have its own limitation, can I do a panel study or so? Inability to cause causation, measurement errors, and the rest. So the idea is that when you look at 10 studies, at most, or 15 studies or 30 studies, you should be able to bring out the limitations. Not all of them might have the limitations, but like I said, you're not condemning the work, but they themselves will state the limitations that they are passing in. Now, basically, this is the format. You have a topic sentence, you have the source and objective, um, of the study. So some format, some school says that the topic, you should write out the topic, the influence of Facebook on academic activities. Then some will even say indent it, but it depends on your PG guide and your PG style. If your supervisor or the PG school says write out the full topic, fine. But if not, some schools will just say paraphrase. You don't have to write it out. So there are different school of thoughts on this. This is very key. We want to know the methodology. So the topic centers the objective, the methodology. If you want to add theory, fine. We want to know the methodology, as simple and straightforward in one sentence. What is the methodology? Because this is what we are going to critique. Then the findings, we want to know the findings. Some people also add findings and recommendations. Fine, if you want your recommendations, if it's insisted, fine. Then review, this is the key thing. We are reviewing the methodology. What is the limitation of the methodology that you want to avoid in your own work? So this is key. This is the review. This is your own voice in the work. Now, this is a sample. Just adding up all these things will give you this. This is the topic sentence. You have the topic sentence. Then you have the objective of the study and the source. Then you have the methodology here, which is critical. Then you have the findings. Then your review, very, very critical. Your review is very, very, very critical. We want to know what is the review, what is the methodological limitation. This is extremely key. This is what we want to find out in the study. So this is a sample for one. When you come, then when you're done, maybe you've done your empirical, all these are empirical reviews. Smith at all, you see all these people. So when you're done, you say the above empirical study shows the strengths and the flaws of, okay, in this study we're using photo voice as a research method, this thing. So you summarize them. What are the themes? You bring them, okay, you did 15 studies. How many of them talked about A, B, C, D? So you cluster them. How many of them talked about this? How many of them talked about this? Now, this is another section that is important. So this one is just a general summary and all. It might be needed to cluster the themes, or it might not be needed. Then the key limitations. This is the one that is important. What are the key limitations contextualized to each study? About what you're discussing about. So Mitchell shows the personal challenge, the challenge of participating in group discussion, personal grudges, you understand. Then you come here, issues. So you bring out the issues, you just summarize. So everything, So this chapter just summarizes all the gaps and repeats. It's just a repetition of what you have done here. So just to have a clean work, you're just repeating all these things that are here, and so that under your empirical review, this is when you're concluding your empirical review, and also, or depending on the study, but here you're just repeating what we want. So the idea is that you are to make sure that your goal is to ensure that you avoid some of these things. So how do they apply to your work? So the goal of the empirical review is to make sure that you identify the gaps in one method. If you're using a multi-method, then fine, combine whether it's survey and interview. Part of it will be the survey part of it will be the interview part. But it is the method you are going to use in your own work that is key, that is critical. It is the method you're going to use in your own work. So this is how to write the empirical review of studies.